Sorry for the delay. Torah study, when everyone got into Torah study this morning. We had a really good time. It's nice to see people here. It's good to see people at home. I will make up the time, as the pilot says, in the air. So I will still get you out of here. Welcome to everybody who's at home watching. And we will begin. You can click on the description on YouTube and you will find the prayer book, Mishkan Tefillah. So I'll announce both sets of page numbers. And I'm going to get our little reading stand. I was at camp all week. I'm a little sleep deprived, and I think I need the extra help as I get older. Oy. There we go, even better. Okay, friends, let's turn in our prayer books, if you would be so kind, to page 192 or 74. We'll begin with Ma Tovu, which we'll be reading in the actual Torah itself in just a couple weeks. Ma Tovu Ohalecha Yaakov Ohalecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Yisrael Ma Tovu Ohalecha Yaakov Ohalecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Yisrael Vani Berov Chastecha Avo Beitecha Eshtachave Elecha Kodshecha Biratecha Matovu Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov Ohalecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Yisrael Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov Ohalecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Yisrael. And we will jump ahead in our Sidurim to Chatzi Kaddish, which can be found on page 224 or 106. Yitkadav v'yitkadash shemei Rabba be'amad yivrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon uvyomechon uvchayedecho beit Yisrael bagala Uvizman kariv imru, amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevorach, ve'olam le'omei amaya, yitbarach, v'ishtabach, v'yipar v'jaman v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar, v'yitaleh, v'yitalal, shmei Kedoshah brichu, ve'olam minko brechata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, Damiran be'alma v'imru, amen. Let's all stand now for Baruch Hu 226 or 108. Baruch Hu et Adonai hamevorach Baruch Hamevorach le'olam ba'ed. la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Let's continue together on the next page. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam yotzer or v'orei choshech v'osei shalom v'orei et hakol hameir la'aretz v'la'arim aleha barachamim uvtivo mechadesh b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh v'reishit ma'arabu ma'asecha Adonai kulam b'chochma asita malach ha'aretz kinyanecha tiparach Adonai Eloheinu al shevach ma'aseh yadecha ve'al me'orei or she'asita yifarucha sela or chadash al tzion ta'ir v'niskei chulanu mehera le'oro baruch atah Adonai yotzer ha'me'orot. Let's all read together in the middle of 231 or 113. Love your neighbor as yourself, you said, and light blinded we saw, that inner and outer worlds are one, as you are one. You spoke and we wrote, we reached for you down the centuries, your light moving before us as we climbed, fell back, climbed again, your Sinai of life, Baruch atah Adonai, habocher ba'amo Yisrael be'ahava. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. 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 Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. Please be seated. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol lebavcha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol meodecha v'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anuchi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam b'shivtecha b'veitecha uvelechtecha v'derech uv'shochbecha uv'kumecha ukshartam leot ayadecha v'hayu letotafot beineinecha uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha uvisharecha leman tiskeru vasitem ekol mitzvotai vitem kedoshim leloechem ani Adonai leloechem asher hotzeiti etchem Me'eretz Mitzrayim lihiyot lachem Elohim ani Adonai Elohechem Adonai Elohechem emet. Let's all turn to page 239 or 121, and we'll read responsively on the bottom half of the page. The eternal truth is that you alone are God, and there is none else. Together. May the righteous of all nations rejoice in your love and exult in your justice. Let them beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Let nation not lift up sword against nation, nor learn war anymore. You shall not hate your brother or sister in your heart. The stranger that sojourns with you shall be accepted as your equal, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Why do you crush my people and oppress the poor, asks God. We know that the Eternal One defends the poor and upholds the rights of the needy. Praise to God Most High. Blessed is God and deserving of blessing. 240, 122. Yam bam bam bim bim bam, yabba ba ba bim bam. Yam bam bam bim bim bam, yabba ba ba bim bam. I da 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 da, yabba ba ba bim bam. I da 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 da, yabba ba ba bim bam. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai. Mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh. Nora tehilot osefele. Nora tehilot osefele. Shira chadasha shipru geulim. Leshimcha, leshimcha, al safatayam. Yachad kulam hodu v'him lechu ve'amru Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. Yam bam bam bim bim bam, yabba ba ba bim bam. Yam bam bam bim bim bam, yabba ba ba bim bam. I da 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 da, yabba ba ba bim bam. I da 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 da, yabba ba ba bim bam. Sur Yisrael, kuma be'ezrat Yisrael, uvdechenu mecha, Yehuda ve'Yisrael. Go aleinu, Adonai tzvaot shemo, Kedosh Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai, Gal Yisrael. We've now arrived to the central part of our service, the Amidah, page 242 or 124. Together, let's stand. Ya la 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 la, 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 ya la 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 la. Adonai sefatai tiftach. Ufi agit ilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. Ya la 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 la, 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 ya la la la. La 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak v'Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel ve'Elohei Leah Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor v'Hanorah El Elyon Gomel Chasadim Tovim Ve'konei Hakol Ve'zocher Chasdei Avot ve'imahot Umevi Gula Lifnei Bneihem Le'man Shemo B'Ahava Melech Ozer Moshiach U'Magen Baruch atah Adonai Magen Avraham Ve'ezrat Sarah Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai Mechayeh Hakol Atah Rav Le'Hoshia morid hatal. Mechakel chaim bechesed, mechaye akol berachamim rabim, somech noflim verofeh cholim, umatir asurim, umekayem emunato, lishenei afar, michamocha bal gevurot, umido melach, melech mimit umechaye, umatzmiach Yeshua, v'ne'eman ata l'chayot hakol, baruch ata Adonai, mechaye hakol. 248 or 130. Nekadesh et shimcha ba'olam, Keshem shemakdishim oto bishmei marom, kakatuv al yad neviecha, vekara zel ze ve'amar, kadosh, 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 Adonai tzevaot, meloch ol haaretz, kevodo. Adir, adirenu, Adonai, Adonenu, madir shimcha b'chol haaretz. Baruch kevod Adonai mimkomo. Echadu Eloheinu, hu avinu, hu malkeinu, hu moshienu, v'hu yashmienu, berachamav le'enei kol chai. Ani Adonai Elohechem, Imloch Adonai le'olam, Elohai Zion, ledor vador. Hallelujah. Ledor vador nagid godlecha, ulenetzach netzachim kedushatcha nagdish, v'shivchacha Eloheinu mipinu lo yamush, le'olam ba'ed. Baruch atah Adonai ha'el hakadosh. Please be seated. Page 250 or 132. Yismechu v'malachutecha shomrei Shabbat v'korei oneg. Am mekadeshei shvi'i kulam yispeu v'yitangu mituvecha. V'hashvi'i ratzita bo v'kidashto, chemdat yamim oto karata, zecher lema'aseh v'reishit. Let's all now read together our prayer for Shabbat, 252 or 134 in the middle of the page. Our God and God of our ancestors, be pleased with our rest, sanctify us with your mitzvot, and grant us a share in your Torah. Satisfy us with your goodness, and gladden us with your salvation. Purify our hearts to serve you in truth. In your gracious love, Adonai, our God, grant us your holy Shabbat as a heritage. May Israel, who sanctifies your name, rest on Shabbat. Blessed are you, Adonai, who sanctifies Shabbat. We continue now with the Amidah as we sing together the words of peace, Sim Shalom, 258 or 140, our prayer for peace. Sim, 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 shalom, sim, 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 shalom, sim, 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 shalom, tova uveracha. Sim, 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 shalom, sim, 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 shalom, sim, 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 shalom, tova uveracha. Yalalai, 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 yalalai. Sim, 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 shalom, sim, 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 shalom. Shalom tova uveracha. Baruch atah Adonai, hamevarech et amo Yisrael b'shalom. Praise are you, Adonai, who blesses your people Israel with peace. Be not afraid of silence. It is more powerful than the awkward word. It allows God's voice to be heard. It allows the tears and the terror, the disbelief and the doubt to tumble out. Be there with the quiet compassion that flows from the depths of your being, through your eyes, your touch, your sighs, into your very soul. Stir not from the hush until you sense that hesitant blush of hope and of understanding. Be not afraid of silence. And so we'll take a moment now for our own silent prayers and meditations, not afraid of that silence, but engaging in it for a place that we can find within ourselves that is pure, that is our essence, to connect with God. Ve'hegyon libi lefanecha Adonai tzuri Adonai tzuri Ve'goali. And now we're going to continue with Seder Kriyat Torah, the service for the reading of Torah. I'm going to find the page. If you have a Plout commentary, you'll be able to follow along in the commentary. We will be actually reading on page 961, or chapter chapter 11, verse 7, if you just have a plain old Bible at home. You can follow along there as well. And the Torah service in your prayer books may be found on page 362 or 244. Ein kamocha ba'Elohim Adonai ve'ein kema'asecha malchutecha malchut kol olamim umemshaltecha bechol dor v'dor Adonai melech Adonai malach Adonai imloch leolam va'ed Adonai oz le'amo yitain. Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom. Please stand. Av harachamim heitiv avirtzoncha et Zion. Tivnei chomot Yerushalayim, Tivnei chomot Yerushalayim, Ki vecha levad batachnu, Melech Eram v'nisa, Adon olamim. 364 and then right to 366. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah. Udvar Adonai merushalayim. Baruch Shenatan Torah, Torah. Baruch Shenatan Torah, Torah. Le'amo Yisrael b'kedushato. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo. We will do a hakafah, but I ask you please to blow kisses to the Torah for the time being, and of course everyone at home can blow kisses as well. Lech Adonai hagedula v'hagevura v'hatiferet v'hanem etzach v'hod kicho b'shamayim uvaretz kicho b'shamayim uvaretz Lech Adonai hamamlacha v'amid naseh lechol lerosh. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu el har kodsho. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu el har kodsho. Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu. Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu. Please be seated. Sorry about that. Okay, let me just give you the correct page. I think I was off by a couple pages if you're following along at home. We are in the third Torah portion of the book of Numbers, Baha'alotecha. And as we did this morning during Torah study, we are going to be focused on, just for the reading this morning, the story of Aaron and Miriam, who gossip about Moses behind his back. And that is on 965, the beginning of chapter 12. So a few verses different than what I had mentioned before. So let's read this together. If there's anyone who would like to join in blessing the Torah, please feel free at home or here to stand up with me, and we can bless the Torah together. If you have a simcha or anything, you have a simcha? Anyone? No? Just being here, being alive, being together, great. You at home, please join us. Baruch hu et Adonai hamborach, Baruch Adonai hamborach le'olam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. Please be seated. Again, we are in chapter 12. V'tedaber Miriam va'Aaron v'Moshe al edot ha'isha ha'kushit asher lakach ki asa kushit lakach v'yomru harak ach b'Moshe daber Adonai halo gambanu daber v'yishma Adonai v'aish Moshe anu me'od mikol ha'adam asher al panei ha'adama. And Miriam and Aaron were speaking about Moses and about his wife, who was Cushite, which is the land of Cush, which is Ethiopia, which is interesting because earlier in the Torah she's mentioned as Midianite, but here she's mentioned as a Yemenite or a Cushite. And so they were talking a little smack about her, as it turns out, the two siblings having a very interesting relationship there, dysfunctional family moment. And God said to them, God overheard this. Moses wasn't there, but God overheard it. And said, well, first of all, they said, who is this Moses guy who gets to speak to God? We also get to speak to God. We're also important. And then it says, Vayishma Adonai, God overheard their conversation between the two, Miriam and Aaron, and said, hey, that guy Moses, he's my guy. Not a direct translation, trying to be a little bit more colloquial, explain it to you in our language, but that's my guy, Moses. It's sort of like Bruce and Pam, you saying, Nick, you're our favorite kid in front of the other two. He's our favorite kid. He's your favorite boy. Okay, good. But Moses is hearing, even though he's not there, is getting a shout out from God here, which probably made Aaron and Miriam feel even better about their relationship with him. And God also explains very explicitly, because Moses is the only person on earth that I trust, that I believe in, that I have confidence in. Vayomer Adonai pitom el Moshe ve'el Aharon ve'el Miriam tze'u shalashtechem El Ohel Moed. And God said, Moses, Aaron, Miriam, meet me at the tent of meeting. Not good. They're about to get a little bit of an admonishment. Vayetzu shloshtem vayered Adonai ba'amod enan. And they all stood outside the tent of meeting of the Mishkan, and God comes down in a cloud. Vayamod petach ha'ohel moed. And they stand at the entrance to the Ohel. Vayikra Aharon and Miriam, vayitzu shenehem, and God speaks directly now to Miriam and to Aaron and says to them, Vayomru, Shim'u na dibri, im Adonai, im yehiyeh niviechem, Adonai b'mara elav otda b'chalom. God says to them, Moses is my prophet. You're speaking smack about my prophet. Moses and I are so close, so tight, that I don't come to him in dreams. I don't come to him in visions or garbled language. I speak, as it says here, edaber bo lo kain. I don't speak to him like that, like my other servants. Moshe bechol beit ne'eman, hu peh el peh, I speak to Moses mouth to mouth, face to face. Et aber, I speak to him. Umira velo bechidat v'tmina yihi yabit umadua lo yiratem lidbrei ba'avdei b'Moshe. And God says to Aaron and to Miriam, when you speak about Moses in a negative way, when you complain about his wife or speak about why he gets more face time or attention with God, with me, when you offend him, you offend me. I take offense to it. And it sort of is like a parent-child thing. Like when you speak negative about my kids, I take it personally. So we'll hold off right there. If you would like to bless the Torah again, please stand. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Please remain standing as the Torah is lifted to be redressed. Vezot haTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei bnei Yisrael al pi Adonai beyad Moshe. Torah, 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 tzivat lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tzivat lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tzivat lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tzivat lanu Moshe. Please be seated. If you'd like to follow along with, excuse me, just get a little water. I'll give you the page for the Haftarah in just a after I get my little reading stand. So our Haftarah for this Shabbat, for Baha'alotecha, can be found, if you have a Plout commentary, on page 974. If you have a regular old Bible, we're in the book of Zechariah, chapter 2, verse 14. So the Torah portion, we didn't read it. We read later on in the Torah portion, begins with instructions, Baha'alotecha, for installing the very first golden menorah, the seven-branched menorah, on the Mishkan. The Haftarah ends with a vision of the menorah itself hanging on the Beit HaMikdash, the holy synagogue that was built in Jerusalem. And Zechariah is preaching in the year 538 BCE, which means he's back in the land of Israel after the Babylonian exile. And it makes sense that one of the things that he's preaching about, having returned to Jerusalem under the reign of the Persian Empire, is the rebuilding of the Second Temple and the reinstallation of the menorah. And so we'll read a little bit from the beginning of the Haftarah portion. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'nviim tovim v'ratza v'divreihem hanemarim be'emet. Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'Torah u'v'Moshe avdo u'v'Yisrael amo u'v'nviei amet v'tzedek. It's a happy Haftarah this week, so that's good. Rani v'simchi beit Zion ki hineniva v'shachneti bet Tochech neum Adonai, v'nilvu goyim rabim el Adonai bayom hahu, vayu li la'am, v'shachanti betochech, v'yadat ki Adonai tzvaot shalachani elayich. V'nachal Adonai et Yehuda chelko al admat hakodesh uvechar aod b'Yerushalayim. So Zechariah says, "Sing joyfully and be glad, fair Zion. Behold, I am coming to dwell in your midst, says the Eternal. And on that day, many nations shall join themselves to the Eternal and become my people. And I will dwell in your midst. Then you shall know that the God of heaven's hosts has sent me to you. The Eternal will take possession of Judah, that is the southern kingdom, God's portion in the Holy Land, and will again choose Jerusalem. Be silent, all flesh, before the Eternal, who is roused from God's own holy dwelling place." And it ends, as we said before, Then I said to the angel who had been talking with me, "What are these, my Lord?" And the angel who had been talking to me answered, saying, "Don't you know what these things are?" "No, my Lord, I don't," I said. Then he explained to me, to Zechariah, saying to Zechariah, then he said, "This is the word of the Eternal to Zerubbabel. Not by might and not by power, but by my Spirit, says the heavens of hosts," which is a very famous song at camp, as it turns out. "What are you, you great mountains? Before Zerubbabel you shall become a plain. He shall bring out the topmost stone, and seeing it shall cry, how beautiful it is." So Zechariah is having what we would call an end-of-time vision, right? One of the parts of the Torah portion is about Eldad and Medad, two Israelites who prophesy, and the rabbis say one of the things that they're prophesying about is the end of time, Armageddon, and that was a no-no. But it turns out in the Torah portion, God didn't have such a hard time with the fact that they were prophesying. The Haftarah, Zechariah, think about it, the Israelites just returned to the land of Israel from Babylonia. It's a very happy Haftarah portion, a happy message. But he has this vision of the end of time, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second, about what will happen. What will happen when the world is at peace, when the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is concluded. And that will be not only this idea, not by might and not by power, but by God's Spirit, which is to say it won't be through great war with casualties, but it'll be through the spirit of the human being, our global potentiality to come together. And that not only will we come together, but come together in this one very spot. So save that thought for just a second while we say the blessing for after the Haftarah being read. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam tzur kol amim tzadik b'chol adorot halaneman haomer ve'oseh hamdaber umkayem shekol devarav emet v'tzedek על התורה ועל העבודה ועל הנביאים ועל יום השבת הזה שנתת לנו אדוני אלוהינו לקדושה ולמנוחה לכבוד ולתפארת. על הכל אדוני אלוהינו אנחנו מודים לך ומברכים אותך. יתברך שמך בפי כל חי תמיד לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת. So the, again, Haftarah portion, just to put it again in context, in case I wasn't making sense before, Zechariah is speaking to the Israelites post-Babylonian exile. So if we remember our biblical history, around the year 585 BCE, so 6th century BCE, so 2,600 years ago or so, the Israelites, the Israelites who lived in the southern kingdom, which was called Yehudah or Judah, which at its center had Jerusalem, were exiled, were expelled by Nebuchadnezzar, who was the emperor of Babylonia. They then went to Babylonia without the temple. The first temple, Solomon's temple, was destroyed. They went to Babylonia, which is now Iraq, so they probably went in and around Baghdad, and they lived there. That was the first time since Egypt that Israelites had lived outside of the land of Israel. We believe there was probably a remnant of Jews that remained in Egypt, but it's a whole different story. So think about it. They left Egypt around 1250 until 585. So 600 plus years. They had been in the land of Israel, and now they were exiled in the diaspora again. Now, the silver lining to being exiled was it was the first time the diaspora Jewry really grew and took foot. It was probably the first time that they would have something resembling what we would call a synagogue, as opposed to the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. And they were very sad because they were kicked out of their homes and sent to several hundred miles away. So when they come back under Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire, it's like Game of Thrones at this point. I'm a big Game of Thrones fan, and during Torah study, I found out many are not. But if you think about the 7 kingdoms, Jerusalem was the center of all of the kingdoms. The Israelites go back, the temple is rebuilt, the Persian Empire is now ruling, and as the Haftarah speaks, they are singing joyfully and be glad because they are home. But what does Zechariah say specifically? He says specifically, if you think about it, on that day, anytime the Bible says on that day, the implication is that day is what we would call the Messianic Era. Other religions would call it Armageddon or the end of the world. We would call it either the Yemot HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah, or in our movement, in the more liberal, progressive Jewish world, we call it Messianic Era, the time when the world will be at peace, when there will be fullness and joy and no sickness and definitely no war. And that, in Judaism, is because we cause it. In other words, we don't have a Messiah, an anointed king of Israel who comes to fix everything or to save us. We have to save ourselves. We have to do the work of perfecting the world. Then we get the Messianic Era. And what happens on that day? Well, God will dwell in our midst. Sounds cool. And you will know that God is the heaven's host. Sounds cool. And the Eternal will again take possession of Judah, of the southern kingdom, of Jerusalem, so on and so forth, and choose Jerusalem as God's home on earth, if you will. And then Zechariah finishes up, "Be silent, all flesh, before the Eternal, who is roused from God's own holy dwelling place." In other words, human activity toward peace, human beings working toward peace and making peace, activates the divine presence off of the divine throne above and drops it below. Make sense? So now we look at the last month, and we look at Israel, and we look at what's happened vis-a-vis the terrorist attacks on Israel from Hamas in Gaza, and this constant, endless war, where you've got a narrative from the quote-unquote Palestinians. And by the way, we should know, whenever someone says there are 2 indigenous peoples in the land of Israel, the Palestinians and the Israelis, it's only partially true. It's only partially correct, I should say, because I don't like to tell someone who has a different truth that they're wrong. There are people who have been indigenous to the land of Israel for many, many years, for thousands of years. But as we can even see from the 6th century before the Common Era, this was the land of the Jewish people, of our ancestors. This was the land from which they were exiled and the land in which they returned and built their holy temple. And it didn't matter if it was Cyrus the Great or if it was the Ottomans all the way throughout history, the Byzantines, whoever. The Israelites, the Jews, marked Jerusalem in particular, but Israel in general, as home base. And what's happened over the last month is, again, another example of what happens when a terrorist organization like Hamas, who controls Gaza, a terrorist organization like Hamas, who was about to win elections in the West Bank, which remarkably were canceled by Fatah, knowing what the outcome was going to be, that they were going to lose power. And they want Jews dead. They want Israel to no longer exist. They claim that this is their land. So the partially true, partially correct part of this is that there really isn't anything Palestinian people. There really isn't anything as the Palestinian people. There's no identification in Torah, for example, and knowing that there is a chronological order, which means Islam doesn't come until probably roughly 800 to 1,000 years after Zechariah is preaching. There's no claim to the land to say, we claim the land, that is to say, Arabs, Muslims, so on and so forth. We claim the land at the same time Jews did because their religion didn't exist at the same time that this is being preached. So I had a very interesting conversation this week with about 4 of our 8 Israeli staff, our shlichim, up at Camp Stein in Prescott, and we were sitting around at lunch. First of all, I was very worried about them because I kept saying, are you okay? Are you okay? This has been a rough last couple of weeks. Are you okay? 2 of them had just gotten back from reserve duty in time to take their flights. The Jewish Agency runs a great program through what's called the Sochanut. They send probably 500-600 Israeli 20-somethings to the United States. They work at camps. They work at JCC camps. They work at overnight camps, Reform, Conservative, all the camps. And so we had about 8 of them. And it was remarkable how perky they were, how energized they were, how excited they were to be here, and how they sort of poo-pooed the idea that they were somehow traumatized from what's gone on in the last few weeks, which is a very Israeli thing to do, right? Yeah. Are you okay? Yeah, we're fine. No, is your family safe? Is everyone? Everyone's fine. And they sort of minimize the impact, a little bit minimize the impact of what's gone on because they are, for better or for worse, used to it. And I don't know how you ever get ultimately used to the idea of people hating Jews and wanting Jews to be dead and wanting to kill Jews. And then you think about it, and I ask them, but what do you think about what's gone on in the U.S., in New York, in Los Angeles, in London? You have Muslims with Palestinian flags driving around neighborhoods saying, kill the Jews and rape their women on loudspeakers. Like, what do you think of what's happened in New York and LA where people are getting run out of neighborhoods and restaurants? And I asked them, do you know that in the U.S. there are people telling Jews to take their yarmulkes off, to take their Jewish stars off? And they didn't know about this. Because for them, anti-Semitism, I shouldn't say they didn't know about this. They don't make the distinction anymore, and they're all 22 to 25, between anti-Zionism, anti-Israel rhetoric, and anti-Semitism. It's all the same. And that's what I think has been most clear to me, as I'm sure it has to you in the last few weeks, that when there's a war or a terrorist operation out of Gaza, launching missiles and rockets out of parking lots for schools and hospitals, that we're not dealing with an equal or even keel. It's not like Hamas has any interest in negotiating peace with Israel. They hate Jews, and they hate Israelis, and there's no difference. And they want Israel not to exist, and they will do everything that they can, even sacrificing their own children, the sick, the elderly, and their own people, the 2 million people who live in Gaza, for the purpose of destroying Jews. And so if we learn anything, we learn that people who hate Israel also hate Jews, that there isn't as much of a difference as there once was, perhaps in the 60s and 70s, and even, I would argue, in the 80s. But the answer, not to leave on such a sad note, is really found in Zechariah. Jews don't have an option not to pursue peace. Jews don't have an option not to pursue peace even with enemies who want you dead. Our tradition, our prophets, our prophecy is to do what it is, when it is, however it is, to defend ourselves at all costs, to speak passionately out against those who speak, for example, on the floor of the U.S. Congress against Israel, who condemn Israel and only give maybe 30% of the story. To fight that, to have conversations, to learn, to teach, and to pursue peace, that's what makes us different. Israel, the Israeli people, the counselors I talked to at camp, they don't want anyone dead. They don't want anyone to suffer. They don't want anyone destroyed. And even in their anger and their rage at what happens when incidents like the last few weeks happen, they know that their job is not only to defend the land of Israel and the people of Israel when they go back and forth, but to come here and be with our campers and teach about Israel and to represent Israel, but also to be positive about the future. The Jewish people aren't going anywhere, that we're going to stay put, and that we're going to fight when we need to fight, but ultimately we will pursue peace because the outcome will be that the unification of humanity depends on Israel being at peace, not just with its neighbors, but within itself. As it says, God will take care of the possession part, but we should always pursue peace, not by might and not by power, but by our spirits, through our acts and through our deeds, even with our enemies. That requires that we must balance ambiguities and tolerate ambiguities. To be a Jew is to wake up probably in the morning, as our Israeli staff did, when they missed their flight on Thursday because it was canceled because of Gaza, and say, we go on to tomorrow, and we will go on until we get to where we're going. It means to wake up in the morning and know that even though I want these people who want me dead to stop doing this, that I must still speak to them, that I must find ways to resolve what feels like, to me, irresolvable obstacles, irreparable damage, if you will. And our prayer on this Shabbat, as it is on every day of the week, including Shabbat, is that the day will come where Zechariah says the people will sing joyfully and be glad, for God is coming to dwell in our midst, for the world will get there. It may not happen in our lifetime, but the ultimate desire of the Jewish spirit is that we will get there. Even with people who don't want us to get there, we will get to a place of peace in that day, whenever it is. So just some thoughts from our Haftarah and a little bit about what's gone on. And I'm looking forward to, as I said last night, having lunch and learn at some point in the month of June or July with our wonderful Israeli team up at camp for you to meet with them and ask questions and interact with them. It's really a great group that we have this year, and we're so very lucky to have them, as will our campers be lucky to hang out with them throughout the summer. Okay, we are going to finish up with the returning of Torah to the Aron HaKodesh. Before we do that, we're going to ask for God's blessings upon those who are ill, members of our community or our families who are in need of our prayers for healing on this Shabbat. If you're watching from home, please feel free to type in the name of a loved one who needs our prayers for healing, and we will take them into our hearts with our own. Please, again, type those in. If anyone here would like to say out loud the name of a loved one you'd like us to ask for refuah shlema, complete healing on this Shabbat, please feel free to say their names at this time. Thank you. Mishaber Chavatenu Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov v'mitenu Sarah Farach v'Leah Hu Yivarech v'Yirapeh et HaCholim Yakirenu HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yimaleh Rachamim Alehem Lahach Limam Rafotam Lachziakam v'Yishlach Lahem Mehera refuah shlema min hashamayim Refuat hanefesh, refuat haguf, hashta b'galav bizman kariv v'nomar, amen. May God, who blessed our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bless and heal those who are ill, the names we have said aloud, those that are on our live stream, and those who are in our hearts. May the Holy Blessed One be filled with compassion for their health to be restored and their strength to be revived. May God swiftly send all of them a complete renewal of body and spirit. And let us all say, Amen. Please turn in your Siddurim to 256 or 374 as we return the Torah to the Aron HaKodesh, and please stand. Yehalelu et Shem Adonai, ki nizgav Shemo levado, hodo al eretz v'shamayim, vayaren keren le'amo, Kehilah lechol chasidav, Livnei Yisrael am kerovo. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Eitz chaim hi v'machazikim ba v'tomcheha meushar deracheha darkei noam v'chol netivoteha shalom. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva chadesh chadesh yamenu Chadesh Yameinu kekedem. 586 or 282. Aleinu l'shabeach l'Adon HaKol, latet gdula le'yotzeh breshit, shelo asanu k'goyei aratzot, velo samanu k'mishpachot ha'adama, shelo sam chelkeinu kahem v'goraleinu kechol hamonam, v'anachnu korim u'mishtachavim u'modim, lifnei melech malchei amlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, She'onotei shamayim ve'osed haaretz, u'moshav yikaro b'shamayim imal, u'shchinatu zo, begovhei meromim, Hu Eloheinu ein od, emet malkeinu efes ulato, kakatuv betorato, v'yadatayom v'hashevota elevavecha, ki Adonai hu Elohim, b'shamayim imal, v'al haaretz, mitachat einod, v'nemar v'yadonai, lemelech al kol haaretz, Bayomahu, yeh Adonai echad, u'shemo echad. Let's read together on the top of 591 or 287. May we gain wisdom in our lives, overflowing like a river with understanding, loved, each of us, for the peace we bring to others. May our deeds exceed our speech, and may we never lift up our hand, but to conquer fear and doubt and despair. Rise up like the sun, O God, over all humanity. Cause light to go forth over all the lands between the seas, and light up the universe with joy of wholeness, of freedom, and of peace. As we prepare for Mourner's Kaddish on this Shabbat, we share our deepest sympathies and note the passing of the following people who were recently laid to their eternal rest and whose families observe Shiva and Shloshim, the immediate 7 and 30 days of mourning. Bill Seidenberg, Gail Signe Evanki. On the Shabbat, we remember those of our congregational family whose yahrzeits occur this week. As I read these names, if you wish to at home, also type in the name of a loved one you'd like us to take into our hearts with our own, someone who has died in this season or in seasons past, or someone you're just thinking about this Shabbat. Please do so as I read our names. Edith Adler, Sandra Ruth Beloff, Norbert Nordy Bick, Evelyn R. Bromberg, Dr. Solomon Buxbaum, Gary Paul Cantor, Hazel Fraser, Ethel Goldvarg, William Halpern, Vera Hirsch, Fanny Camper, Dr. Melvin Kaplan, Harriet Klein, Rachel Kozak, Margit Laker, Ben Lando, Michael Lerner, Morris Lerner, Trudy Lessem, Esther Levine, Dr. Bernard Lipschultz, Renee Lorsch, Ruth Schwartz Needleman, Morris Nodiff, Irma Oppenheim, Sarah Ora, Doris Orlikoff, Ralph Reynolds, Louis Robbins, Alan Glenn Roth, Florence Sanford, Nona Siegel, Bertha Seiden, Esther Alice Schaefer, Ellie Shapiro, Zelda Sherman, Beatrice Miller Snoren, Fred G. Sohn, Jackie Solomon, Mala Victor, Anna Wazotsky. If anyone here would like to say out loud the name of a loved one, please do so at this time. May all of their souls be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. Mourner's Kaddish can be found on 598 or 294. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah, be'amad yivrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, ba'agala v'izman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shemei rabbah mevorach le'alam u'le'almei almaya. Yiparach v'yishtabach v'yipa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal, shmei d'kudsha b'richu, le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechemata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shalama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. May the source of peace and peace to all who mourn and comfort to those who are grieving. As together we say, amen. And we will complete our service with our prayer for peace yet again, Oseh Shalom, and then bless our Kiddush, bless our grape juice with Kiddush, and also Hamotzi for our Challah. Oseh Shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imeru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imeru amen. Alrighty then, it's time for Kiddush and Hamotzi. If you have a Kiddush cup at home, please feel free to grab it. If you're just drinking wine for the fun of it, that counts too. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei pari agafen. L'chaim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen. Shabbat shalom, and thank you again for your patience.